games, I worked with Wendy at our ranch tent. I trust that Wendy and the others who were on the watch may recall the many other tents that were there, our neighbors. There were the clan societies, such as the Clan Nickel Society, and I got to say hi to an old friend. There was also the Spinner and Weavers Guild, and the Gaelic choirs led their tents with information on their organizations. But there was another tent that was, I think, a kitty corner to us from the Victoria Freemasons. And they had literature, and it just said on the sign, Freemasonry, questions answered. Fellow members of the Victoria branch of the United Empire Loyalists Association, fellow loyalists and guests, my talk is entitled The Crown and the Square, the United Empire Loyalists and the Freemasons. Now, before I proceed in my talk, I need to make some disclaimers. In the past few decades, there's been much written, said about the Masons, especially on esoteric matters, conspiracy theories. There's been novels, movies made. Some of these even go back to the 1700s, everything from the identity of Jack the Ripper to plots of world domination and so on. And there's also theological issues. I don't know what church you belong to, but the Roman Catholic Church has a long prohibition of its members joining the Masonic Lodge, as do a few Protestant churches. Now, my talk is not about these matters. That's not what I'm going to talk about. Although one thing I will note, though, is that certainly one Masonic conspiracy theory is pretty much undermined by some of the information that I will be giving. So that's again a disclaimer. I will also mention that I'm not a Mason myself, although my late father was a 14th degree Scottish Rite Mason. And so are a few relatives on my dad's side of the family. I don't know if any of you are Masons or if you have relatives in the Masonic Lodge. So, please bear with me. I'm looking at this balanced and objective view. My talk will be divided into 3 sections. First, I'll make a brief description of who the Masons were and are. Secondly, I'll talk about the development and spread of Masonry in Great Britain and to the American colonies. And then third, I will cite the examples of some Masons among the United Empire Loyalists. This is a picture of a Masonic hall in Belleville, Ontario, a city which was settled by Loyalists and which still has many Loyalist descendants today. But in the early 1980s, pardon?
No, sorry.
Somebody say something?
No.
Okay. In the early 1980s, my late mother and my late father and I were doing research on our family tree, on both sides of my family, but in particular on my mother's side. We were trying to track down our descent from Solomon Huff. And some of our friends in the Kawartha branch of the UEL Association referred us to a gentleman in the Bay of Quinte area, close to Belleville. And my mother and I went to visit this gentleman at his home, where he gave us some talk. And I well remember when we were driving home after our meeting with him. His name is Mr. Wanamaker.
Oh.
Oh, well, that name ring a bell. But anyways, my mother said to me that she noticed that he had a Masonic ring, which would indicate that he was a Mason. And my mother's very observant, and having been married to a Mason all these years, she would notice something like that. And this reminds me of a saying some Masons have, that many things are hidden in plain sight. And here's a good example of this. This is a Masonic hall in Pickering, Ontario. Pickering is somewhere between Kingston and Toronto. It is a much older building, probably 19th century. The previous hall you saw in Belleville was built in the 1950s. But the Masonic Order, or Masonic Lodge, if you will, was and is a social organization. It's a club, a fraternity, or a brotherhood. And popular Scottish author Neil Ferguson, in his recent book, Tower and the Square, he comments that it was a pioneering social network of its time, because the subtitle of his book is called Networks of Power, from the Freemasons to Facebook.
Oh.
This is a picture of the old Masonic Hall in Kingston, Ontario. At the time I lived in Kingston as a student, and then as well when I was back in Kingston as a in the armed forces. This was the Masonic Hall, but the Masons have fallen on hard times and they had to sell that hall. I don't know exactly what it's used now. But by the 1700s, Masonic lodges were about building the moral and ethical character of their members. The trade of the stonemason was used to allegorically teach these moral and ethical lessons. And many of these lessons are also taught in secrecy. Now, as a non-Mason, I don't know what all of them are. And if I were a Mason, I wouldn't be allowed to tell you. So the Masons aren't really a secret society. They're known. You know, any Mason will tell you they are. What they are is a society of secrets. The picture of Masons in Ottawa, and this is showing their regalia, what they wear. The lambskin apron is the most noticeable. That is symbolic from something symbolic from the stonemasons. The stonemasons wore that as protection and to carry their tools. They also have a collar with their insignias. But those who joined the fraternity do so voluntarily as seekers, or and as our neighbors at the Highland Games were doing, they just answered questions. You had any questions, if you wish to pursue becoming a Mason, well, they'd be happy to help you. It is open to any man of the age 21 or 18 if you are the son of a Mason, or that's called a Lewis. Now, for you ladies, and I notice that us men are outnumbered here, there are some Masonic lodges that have opened up to women, but for the most part, women are politely referred to the Order of the Eastern Star, which was formed about in the mid-1800s. Now, in a Blue Lodge, or a Craft Lodge, as it's called, there are these 3 degrees when a candidate joins. The first is the earned apprentice degree, followed by the fellow craft, and then the Master Mason. And in the ritual of the Master Mason, it is written, I don't know all the precise details, I wouldn't, and I wouldn't be telling you, there are a lot of questions are asked, being subjected to the 3rd degree. And there's an expression in our language that has come from the Masons when you get all these hard questions being subjected to the 3rd degree. And there's a few other expressions too in our language from the Masons, like, I'm going to level with you. And the right angle is another. But again, the analogy of the builder is used to build moral and ethical character at each of these steps. Masons can go higher up the ladder in what is known as the higher degrees, like the Scottish Rite, which my father did, the York Rite, Shriners, Knight Templars, but they're governed by separate bodies. However, any Mason doing so has to remain a Master Mason and a member of a Blue Lodge, or Craft Lodge, when doing so. This is the inside of the Masonic Hall in Kingston, where these rituals that I've mentioned about are held. And this is His Royal Highness the Duke of Kent, the Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England, and the highest Mason in the English-speaking world. He is a distant cousin of the Queen. And I'm just going to read a quote from him. It's from a book by a British author. He said that each lodge developed in its own way, with its own traditions and differences, but all subscribed to the basic principles of brotherly love, relief, and truth. And among its members have been some who were and are prominent in various areas of life, and whose work and ideas have materially affected or greatly enriched the lives of not only their fellow members, but mankind in general. Most of them, however, have been ordinary men who have attempted to live their lives by the practical lessons of morality, duty, and service, which they have learned from their lodge. And I'll also read a similar quote. This is from a Master Mason near Picton, Ontario, which is an area which was also settled by Loyalists. And this Master Mason says, this is on the occasion of the 200th, his name is Dale Porter, and it's on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of Prince Edward Lodge number 18. What Freemasonry teaches us is not just words, but a way to live our lives honorably. if it were not for this commitment from charter members in 1811 right through to the members of 2011, a volunteer organization like ours could never continue to flourish and prosper the way that Freemasonry has, not only in Picton, but across the face of the earth. And I'll have much more to say about that lodge in Picton later in my talk. This is a picture from a drawing from the 1700s in England of a Masonic ritual. I believe it is the initiation of the earned apprentice degree. You see the person's blindfolded and he's being brought before the lodge master. It was in the 1700s that this modern masonry or speculative masonry did come into being. And on St. John's Day in June 1717, 4 lodges in London assembled at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern to form the Grand Lodge of England. They would oversee all these local craft lodge or blue lodges and help to charter new lodges. And from that point on, masonry grew in Britain. As it grew in England, they created a number of provincial Grand Lodges. And at one point there was a dispute between one group called the Ancients, one group called the Moderns. The Ancients formed a rival Grand Lodge in the 1750s, but then eventually in 1813 the two lodges reconciled to form the United Grand Lodge of England. By the 1750s there were Grand Lodges in Scotland and in Ireland. So it became very fashionable in England, Scotland, Ireland in the 1700s to be a Mason. This is a famous painting by William Hogarth. He was a well-known painter, lived in London. He was a Mason himself. I don't even may notice, but that is of a Mason coming home from a lodge meeting. He's supposed to be drunk, and he's helped by Tyler. He liked to show a bit of satire, but it again shows how Masonry was becoming very much a part of life in 18th century Britain. But with links of culture, language, and trade between Britain and the 13 American colonies, Masonry spread across the Atlantic. And the first signs of a Masonic lodge was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the 1730s. But lodges were also formed in Boston, New York, Alexandria and Fredericksburg, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. These were all port cities, which would have that direct link. That's one of the ways how Masonry did trade. Merchants would join, professionals would join, and they'd hear about it and be very interested in it. This is the picture of the Masonic Temple in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was built in the mid-1800s. But in the 1700s, this is where usually Masons met, in the inns and taverns. And this is the Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, where it's said that the first Masonic lodge did meet. Also, with the growth of Masonic lodges in the American colonies, provincial Grand Lodges were being created. The first one being in Pennsylvania, and the first Grand Master of the Pennsylvania Grand Lodge was Benjamin Franklin. But Masons would meet in these, they have a room to themselves for their formal meeting and rituals. After the meeting, they would gather informally and have a few drinks, a meal together, and they would, now in the lodge meeting they can't talk politics, that's one of the rules. But informally they could now talk politics, and it was not uncommon in the pubs and coffee houses of, in the late 1700s in the 13 colonies to talk politics. And this is where Masons would start to take sides in the disputes between the colonies and Great Britain. There were Masons who were on the revolutionary or patriot side, and Masons who were on the loyalist side. This is a famous American Masonic picture. This was actually painted in the 1866, but this is of George Washington, who was a Mason from 1752, as well as a few other patriot leaders like Paul Revere, Benjamin Franklin, who I mentioned, were also Masons. He's often held up by American Masons as a shining example. But also, this is, well, later King George IV, he was one of King George III's son. He's not in his Masonic regalia, but he was a Mason, as was King William IV and Prince Edward, who was the father of Queen Victoria. Now, I'm going to skip a few decades. This is King Edward VII in his Masonic regalia. And here is King George VI, the father of our late Queen. He's not wearing his Masonic regalia, but as you can see, he's with his Masonic brethren. He was quite an enthusiastic Mason. In fact, it was he who encouraged Prince Philip to at least, go through the earned apprentice degree. Prince Philip didn't continue after that, although he paid his dues. However, Prince Charles is not a Mason, and that has fueled some conspiracy theories about as to why. Now this is from the Grand Lodge of Canada. You see pictures of some famous Canadian Masons. You probably recognize John A. Macdonald. You may recognize Joseph Brant. There's John Molson, who, of course, Canada's name in beers in 1786. Some of them, I think that's Bobby Mon, the hockey player. Aside from Joseph Brant, I don't think many of these are UELs or UL descendants. But I did find, hidden in plain view, a few examples of UELs who were Masons. This is John Graves Simcoe. He was the commanding officer of the Queen's Rangers. He was actually from England, but he was commanding officer of the Queen's Rangers, one of the Royalist regiments that took part in a number of actions. There's one legend that at the Battle of Brandywine, when some of the Continental soldiers were running away, he ordered them to stop firing, because he may recognize that one of them just happened to be George Washington. And I suspect if the legend's true, it was probably an act of Masonic chivalry on his part. But later he went back to England, and then he came back to North America, where he was Lieutenant Governor of the newly created province of Upper Canada from 1791 to 1796. And I'll just read something about him, because he's very much the father of Ontario. There's many places named for him, schools, Lake Simcoe, Simcoe County. There's a lot of Simcoe streets, including in James Bay, but I suspect that Simcoe Street in James Bay is indirectly named for him, as it's probably named for Lake Simcoe, because there's a lot of streets that are named for lakes. He's first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. It was he who brought in our legal system for British common law in Upper Canada, because it had been separated from Lower Canada, which had the French system. He brought trial by jury, English common law, and he also abolished slavery, which was pretty enlightened and pretty much ahead of its time. It was until 1833 that the British Empire would finally abolish slavery. But he had become a Mason in 1773, and then later he would go back to England. It was 1806 that he passed away. Now another noted Mason is an associate of his, this gentleman, William Jarvis. And it's he that Jarvis Street, Toronto, is named for. William Jarvis was also an officer in the Queen's Rangers. He was from Connecticut. And he didn't become a Mason during the American War of Independence. He became one later on when he left Connecticut for England. And that's when he became a Mason, and then he came back to North America, where he was given the position of a registrar, but he was also made the provincial Grand Master for the newly formed Grand Lodge for Upper Canada. I'm just going to read a few quotes from a letter of his. I'm in possession of the sign manual from His Majesty, constituting me Secretary and Registrar of the Province of Upper Canada, with the power of appointing my deputies, and in every other respect a full warrant. I am very much flattered to be enabled to inform you that the Grand Lodge of England have within these very few days appointed Prince Edward, who is now in Canada, Grand Master of Ancient Masons of Lower Canada, that's modern-day Quebec, and William Jarvis, Secretary and Register of Upper Canada, as Grand Master of Ancient Masons in that province. However trivial it may appear to you who are not a Mason, he's writing a letter to a relative in New Brunswick, yet I assure you that it is one of the most honorable appointments that they could have conferred. The Duke of Atholl is the Grand Master of Ancient Masons in England. I am ordered my passage on board the transport with the regiment and do duty without pay for the passage only. So he certainly left his mark too on Canada. And this is a badge commemorating the 200th anniversary of the Prince Edward Lodge in Prince Edward County. And you notice from the design of the badge, they know their roots. And I'm going to read from the local newspaper. A quotation from the Grand Master of Ontario, speaking at this occasion of this lodge's 200th anniversary. It is not about money, as some seem to think. It is about attitude, commitment to an idea, and the pursuit of an ideal. It is about the zeal of Freemasonry displayed by those early settlers, the United Empire Loyalists, in establishing lodges here in their new homeland. It is about the determination of the founding fathers of this lodge, Joshua Hayward, William Blakely, Robert Coughlin. It's about the dedication of these faithful members that have maintained the principles of Freemasonry in Prince Edward Lodge through good times and bad for 2 centuries. It's about the brethren of this lodge that have displayed those principles of morality and virtue into the community at large, assuming leadership roles that have shaped this historic town and made it a better place for their fellow citizens. Is about unsevering loyalty to the timeless and timely ideal that is the essence of Masonic philosophy. So I've talked about some people high up, like Governor Simcoe and as well as William Jarvis, who are Masons. And here are some people further down the social scale. And this is a map. It's not the best map, but it shows the Bay of Quinte area. And some other sources I found was in this very big book, Pioneer Life on the Bay of Quinte. It was written in the early 1900s. My mother had a copy. I looked through it, and I came across one family called the Simeon Ashley family. A prominent pioneer Mason and United Empire Loyalist was Simeon Ashley. Official records show that he was a prominent man in the Bay of Quinte region as early as 1819, having been chosen to represent the Belleville Lodge at the Masonic Convention at Kingston in that and the following year. He was an active, intelligent man, and for years carried on the hotel business at Foxborough. By his wife Mary Nash, he has a large family, as seen by the genealogical table annexed. And they mention his son Hiram, who is also a member of the Lodge Royal Chapter and is past master of Moira Lodge in Belleville. Remember that quote from the Duke of Kent, that there were Masons who were very prominent. I've mentioned, again, Governor Simcoe, as well as William Jarvis. But here is some people who were just ordinary people who were also Masons among the United Empire Loyalists. So if I may wrap this talk up, there's a lot of lessons to learn. Again, I've talked about how conspiracy theories are disproved because we had Masons on both sides. And if you look at the American Revolution from the Masonic angle, and there's another expression in our language, it wasn't just a civil war. It was quite literally a brothers' war, because Masons do regard themselves as brothers, whatever political side they take. But also from a research side, my talk is very pioneering, because I found that Canadian authors have not really dealt deeply on the subject as British and American authors. I mentioned Neil Ferguson. Here's another book by a British author called The Craft. Both scholarly and popular historians have written on it. Also, I found some very interesting scholarly articles in the US about Masonry in the colonial period. This is a master's thesis from the University of North Dakota by a scholar who is a Mason and also is a US Air Force officer. But in Canada yet, the scholars or even popular historians haven't really dealt with it. It's very much hidden in plain view. You know, you find in official Masonic histories, they'll mention about those who were United Empire Loyalists. And then in books about the United Empire Loyalists, they'll instantly mention, oh yes, they were Masons. But I do challenge authors, be they popular or scholarly, to let's do a deep dive on this subject. So it is a matter that is hidden in plain view, as my mother had noticed when we had our meeting with Mr. Wanamaker. And that concludes my talk, and I'll take any questions and I'll try to answer them the best I can. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm interested because I read about the Knights Templar, and it was supposed to be the Masonic Lodge group from the Knights Templar. But what I read was that that's not true. So can you speak on that?
Okay. All the best I can say is that there are these theories and contention about the origin of the Masons in modern times. Yes, there is one view that they grew out of the Knights Templar than the actual stonemasons. But there is some marrying up of the two, because the Knights Templar were a very powerful order in medieval Europe until they were suppressed on order from the Pope. Well, actually it was the French king who suppressed it more than the Pope did. And many of them fled to Scotland. And the Templars would employ stonemasons to build their preservatories, their castles, their fortresses, and it was from the Templars that many of these esoteric secrets would be passed to the stonemasons. But however, in the Masonic hierarchy, there is a Knights Templar. But for a Mason to be a Knights Templar, you have to be a Master Mason and a Royal Arch, and also a Professor Christian to be a Knight Templar. In fact, my grandfather was both a Master Mason and a Knight Templar.
Wow, thank you.
You're welcome. I mean, there's this, again, I'll just add that there's a lot of disputes over the origin of the Masons. Even Masons themselves will dispute that. Will make a lot of disputes. Yes, Judy?
Alex, I'm just curious and validating what you said, because I had an impression of secrecy and no openness, but what strikes me is so much of the philosophy and the attitudes of the Freemasons guided, maybe, and I put this in broad concepts, maybe guided our ethical and moral behaviors in Canada. Around how we behave with people, what our expectations are of who we are. And it just strikes me, and I never really thought about it before. And I'm just saying Canada could be a broader aspect. So
yeah.
What I'm suggesting, though, is that thank you for opening my eyes to that. I didn't appreciate it at all. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, as I said, my father was a Mason. And I have to, when I started reading about it, it started to make sense when I think about what my dad was like. You know, he was a very fair man, and you know, I don't have, you know, he raised me quite well. I'm happy to say he may have there's only a few faults I'd ever say about him, but still, you know, he probably learned a lot from being a Mason. Yes, Wendy.
I have a question for you. My husband's father, James Clapp, was a member of the Masons in Prince Edward County, and when he passed away, we did not know what to do with his Mason items. So if someone passes away and they're a Mason, what do you do with the items that belong to them?
Well, probably the best thing to do would be to contact the lodge and ask, you know, we have this Masonic item, would you like, because usually they'll keep items like this to put on display. Sometimes the Masons do have open house and museums. In fact, I do have my father's lambskin apron. I wasn't able to find it, and I just brought it to show.
We have somebody has a apron.
Yes, Joan?
So going through the artifacts from my family, and this is the bunch that come from Wolf Island, which you will know well. Sure.
Yes, just south of Kingston.
Yes. So one of the documents has AOUW. So I looked that up, and it's Ancient Order of United Workmen. And I wondered, do you know that? Do you know what that stands for, and how is that different from Freemasons?
It's a good question. I actually, I've come across it in that book on the Bay of Quinte Pioneers. I don't know too much about that organization, but because there were a lot of other fraternities that were very similar and modeled on the Masons, like the Oddfellows, the Foresters, and also the Orange Order, which will probably be a topic of a future speech I'll give. And of course the Roman Catholic Knights of Columbus, which they created because they're not allowed, Catholics are not allowed to join the Masonic Order. But that's something I'll look into.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Would there be any records kept by the lodges which would be useful for genealogical research?
Probably.
And if so, how far back may that go?
Well, you probably have to ask the Masons about that, back, especially in back east. You know, records are kept by individual lodges. Also, the Grand Lodge would be your first, I would say, probably your first point of contact, unless you know of a certain lodge that an ancestor of yours belonged to. But yes, it would definitely be a good resource for genealogy.
Thanks a lot, Ellie. Maybe it's because I'm an engineer, but I just got this idea.
So is my father.
And you mentioned Egypt. Masonry goes way back into our civilization's history. And in fact, if you think about it, every picture that we have about something that's older or really old was built by a stonemason. So the tradition of stone masonry goes right back to when we started putting pebbles together on the beach or whenever that happened. So there's a 5,000-6,000 year tradition of stone masonry coming up to the last century when steel and concrete came in. So it's very interesting, this whole continuity and this idea of going back in time.
Oh, yeah. Well, you find that especially in Masonic writings.
Yeah.
I have Albert Mackey's History of Freemasonry, which describes what exactly you're saying.
That's not the only group that's trying to trace its roots back to Egypt and beyond. But anyway, that's the theme, and really that's all that we can see of those civilizations were built by stonemasons. Now their ideas still flow, etc., and continue to affect us. But the pictures are of things that were built by stonemasons. Quite interesting.
Okay, one more, because I just looked at the
Just a matter of
time.
interest, my father was a Mason, and he had the ring. And he once told me that when he came to Saskatchewan as a pioneer in the 1800s, in the early 19th, he used that ring instead of money.
Oh,
And that ring bought him things that he needed money for.
Yeah.
But because he was a Mason,
okay.
he got
Nice.
food and things that he
Trusted.
needed.
Well, again, that's relief, brotherly love and relief.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
the principles.
Yeah.
And
That's remarkable.
Interesting.
okay, we've maybe time for one more.
Thank you for your talk. I just found out that my uncle was a Mason. I didn't know, because she was in the Eastern Star.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah, so he was.
for the women.
My mother was an Eastern Star too.
That's great.
Alec,
Yes.
I think we're a little bit overwhelmed. Because now all of a sudden we are thinking back to our own families and to our past generations, and I too, it too triggered that my grandfather was a Mason, and his funeral in Barons, Alberta was attended by all the Masons in the area. Anyway, I wish to thank you for your incredible research and to provide us with such an interesting topic to reflect upon, and to provide us with yet another leg to research in our own families. And here we go again. It's like that centipede with so many legs. You think you've got one covered, but the other one just appears. So thank you again, and we look forward to your work on the newsletter.
Thank you.